Hello Buzzers, John here. In this video I wanted to talk to you about the benefits of adjustment layers, to explain what they are and show the massive advantages you get by using this form of layer when you're editing your images in Photoshop. Now in our Layers Made Easy video I explained what goes on with layers themselves, so if you haven't seen that, take yourself 20 minutes and have a look at that video to understand the basics of layers. What we're going to do though is move on to adjustment layers, but before we go into adjustment layers, to understand the advantages that they offer over traditional pixel-based layers, we first need to have a look at what happens with pixel layers. So I'll use this image here, which is a shot of an owl taken on one of our famous Birds of Prey workshops. And if we're going to use layers, we need to have our layers panel up on screen. So if yours isn't already there, just go to Window and choose layers from the list and it will pop up on screen. Okay, so the first thing we need to do with any image is kind of assess it and decide what we want to actually do to improve or enhance it. And in this image, I think first of all I need a bit more contrast because it looks a bit washed out. I also need a color balance change because at the moment it looks rather cool. It's all a bit kind of blue and faded and I want to boost the colors and make it a bit warmer. And the other thing I might want to do is perhaps darken the background a little bit once I've got my contrast changes there, just to make our subject really stand out. So, how do I go about this? Well, I could use the image adjustments menu. So at the moment we've got the image, a JPEG, straight out the camera, and to make an adjustment we simply go to Image, we want to adjust it, so let's go to Adjustments. This presents us with a list of options. We've got brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure, vibrance, hue, saturation, color balance. We've got all kinds of different options here. So what do we want to change? Well, contrast was the thing. Now we could actually just do it by using brightness contrast, but to give ourselves some really good control, I'm going to open the levels palette. So we click on levels and that brings up the levels palette on screen. You can see here the histogram of the image. This is a graph that's a representation of all the pixels in the image from the dark ones over here to the bright ones over here. And the first thing we immediately notice about this image is there's no black. This is the black point here, but there's a gap between the black point and the graph. So if we move the black point to meet the graph, we make sure that the darkest tones are black. So that happens when we move that black point slider in. Over at the other end of the graph, we have to move the white point slider in to meet the graph here, because that means that the very brightest tone in the picture is pure white. So that's set our overall parameters and improve the contrast of the image. And if we toggle the preview button, we can see the difference. That's where we were before and it all looks a bit washed out. And that's where we are, a bit crisper, a bit more contrast, and a full range of tones because we've remapped the pixels in the histogram. So we could do that and we click OK. That's improved our contrast. Next we wanted to improve the color balance and warm up the image. So we go to Image, down to Adjustments, and we can pick Color Balance. So we select that from the list. This gives us our color balance palette where we have the tone balance between shadows, midtones and highlights. So we can adjust the way the colors are represented across these three tonal ranges in the picture. So we'll start with highlights and we'll increase the red content. That's looking better already. And we'll decrease the blue, which means increasing yellow. That brings the sun out on the image quite nicely. We could then do a little bit in midtones maybe, just a hint of red and yellow in the midtones. And then the shadows, I think we normally add a little bit of blue just to take out that yellow wash that's hitting the lower tones, and that works quite well. And that gives us a much sunnier image. And again, we can use the preview box here to toggle it on off. That's where we were, and that's where we are. Looks altogether much better. So we click OK to that. Now the last thing we wanted to do was darken the background. So to darken the background on its own, we need to separate that from the rest of the image. So what we've really got to do is draw around the background. And we can do this quite roughly using the freehand lasso tool, this one here. So we want to select the background. So let's just start over here and we'll go inside our subject because we're going to feather this and soften the edge. But we'll just do a rough selection around the perimeter of our subject down to about here, off the edge of the screen, back up, round, there we go. We've made our selection now, a rough selection of that part of the picture. We need to include this bit here as well. So to add to that selection, we'll hold down the Shift key, because that adds, and we draw around this bit too. So we get all of our kind of green background selected. So now we've done that, we've got marching ants around the parts of the image we want to change. And to make sure we get a subtle change, we need to soften the edge of the selection. So to do that, all we have to do is click on this Select and Mask button. And if you've got the right view mode enabled, you'll see your selection. To change the view mode, if yours is on something like this, onion skin or marching ants or whatever, just set it to overlay or hit V on the keyboard and you'll get a decent looking view mode that shows you the selected area and the unselected area. We need to give this a soft edge. So to do that, we use this slider here called Feather. Let's move that up a bit. We keep moving it up until we see that edge nice and soft. And I think for this image, something like that should be okay, about sort of 80 pixels or thereabouts on this particular example. So there's our soft edge. All we've got to do now is click OK. And now that selection we've made has got a soft edge around it. Doesn't look any different, but it has a soft edge around our owl. So we need to adjust this area as well, and we're going to make this a bit darker. So let's go back up to Image and Adjustments, and we can choose what makes it darker. Well, we could use levels again because that's a contrast control, and we could then move in the black point, and you see the background getting a little bit darker and more contrasty, and we could also move the midtone slider to make it darker still. So that's the kind of thing we want. We can now click OK, and we could get rid of our selection lines by going to Select and choosing Deselect. So we've made our changes. But all our changes have been destructive. We've actually changed the pixels themselves on the base image. So we've got no way of amending any of our decisions. We can't decide to change the color balance or change the contrast or the background or anything like that. We're kind of stuck with what we've done on this image. So it's not a very smart way of working because there's no flexibility involved in the decisions we've made. All too often in image editing, you may find that a change you made further down the line affects the change you made earlier in the sequence. So if you did contrast first, for example, and then you do color balance or levels or whatever afterwards, you might find you want to go back and reduce the contrast adjustment. But we can't without starting from scratch and undoing everything so far. So not a great way of working. So what I'm going to do is do that undo. I'll go to Edit, Undo Deselect, Edit, Undo Levels, Edit, Undo Select and Mask, Edit, Undo Lasso, Edit, Undo Lasso, Edit, Undo Color Balance, Edit, Undo Levels. And then we're back to where we started from, and we've got to do it all over again to make changes. Not a very efficient way of working. Laborious, dull, the kind of thing that would put you off using image editing software at all. So let's try another way. Instead of working directly on our background layer, what we could do is make a copy of that layer. And to do that, we drag the background over the Create a New Layer icon, release the mouse, and we get a background copy. We can now do our contrast change on this. Okay, let's do that. Image, Adjustments, Levels, and we make that black point and white point change to boost contrast. Click OK. So we've got our levels adjustment set on this separate layer. Let's now do our color balance adjustment. So we'll make another copy of this layer. So we drag that to the Create a New Layer icon and release the mouse. We've now got a background copy too. And we could do our color balance change on here. So we go to Image, Adjustments, and choose Color Balance. And we make that color balance change by moving our reds up, our blues down, that kind of thing in highlights. And we'll do a bit in midtones like so. And we'll do a little bit of blue in the shadows. And we click OK to that. So now we've got our color balance change over the top of our contrast change. We can switch them all off and say, well, there's the levels adjustment, there's the color balance adjustment, and all we've got to do is that background change too. So now let's quickly select our background. So we'll just whiz round that again. I'm going to do it very quickly this time. It may not be entirely accurate, but let's not worry too much. That's the sort of thing there, and round the top, and we've made that selection. There we go. Then we press Shift and we make this selection here to add that point to the selection. Then we've got to feather the edge, so we go to Select and Mask, and we increase our feather slider, about 80 pixels or so, wasn't it? Yeah, and then we click OK. So we've got our selection made, we've got our feathered selection in place, and what we need to do is get this area into a new layer so we can edit it independently. So there's a great shortcut you'll have seen in the first video, and to do that you hit Control or Command and J. That punches this feathered selection into a new layer. We can look at it there. There it is. There's our background independent from the subject. And we can now change it by doing an image adjustments change on here. So we go to image, we go to adjustments, and we use levels again. And we're going to move the black point in a bit to make the background darker. And we used a bit of midtones as well. So that gives us a darker background. We click OK, and we've made our changes. Now, in a sense, all these changes are kind of independent because they're on separate layers. This one here, that's our contrast change. The next one up has got our contrast change plus our color balance change. And the third one, we've got an independent change on just the background. But in every instance, we have manipulated the pixels themselves, and we don't have to do that. And one thing I'd encourage you to have a quick look at is the status bar down here. If you look at that, we've got a document size and it says 22.7 megabytes. That's the original picture, or what size it would be for the flattened printed image. And we look here, we've got 95.8 megabytes. And that's because we've got all these extra pixels we've added. We've got 4 layers of pixels instead of 1. So that ramps up our document size and ramps up the kind of processing power that the computer has to use in order to process the image. So at present we're running nearly 100 megabytes of data on a 22.7 megabyte image in order to create that change with all these extra layers. So this works, but we can't really change our mind without again manipulating pixels. So it's not an efficient way of working, it's not a flexible way of working, and it's simply not very practical. So let's try another way. I'm just going to click on this top layer, then hold Shift and click on this background copy layer so I can get rid of all 3 of these layers in one fell swoop. There we go, they've all gone. So this takes us back to our background layer, which is the original. Now instead of running pixel layers, I can instead use something called adjustment layers. You'll notice in that image adjustments menu, there's lots of options to choose from. And if we click down here in the layers panel, this half black, half white circle, that's the adjustment layer icon. Click on that and you'll see a very similar list of changes you can make. I can't see the whole thing at the moment. Let me just condense the layers panel a little bit and you can see them there. There you go. There's our list of adjustments that we can make using an adjustment layer. So what is it? Well, let's have a play. We wanted to change our levels overall to give us more contrast in the image. That was our first change. So let's click on the adjustment layer icon and choose levels from the list. Everything kind of looks the same. We've got our levels palette on screen and we can move in our black point slider and our white point slider to meet the graph and increase our contrast. That's all good, but we don't have the actual pixels here. Instead, we just have something called levels 1. This is just a levels adjustment layer. Now the next thing we want to do is color balance. So we click on the adjustment layer icon and we'll choose this time color balance. We now get our color balance palette up and we can make our changes. We can select the highlights and we make that change there. Was it something like that we did? Yep, and then we go for midtones and we make a more subtle diagonal line like so. And then we go for shadows and we can add a little bit of blue into the shadows. And that's all looking good. The final change was this background where we had to make a selection first. So bear with me while I run through that. We've got our lasso chosen and we're simply going to whiz round the background. Oh, dodgy selection, don't worry about that. You would take a bit more time doing this. Round the top, so we select that area there. And then we've got to hold Shift and add this little area here to it. That's the sort of thing. Then we feathered that selection, so we go to select and mask, and we went for about 80 pixels. We're doing the same thing over and over here, so nothing to worry about at all. We're just repeating ourselves, but using a slightly different structure or method in how we get there. So there's our feathered selection. What we're now going to do is create another adjustment layer and make that contrast change to darken the background just as we did before. So we click on the adjustment layer now, we choose levels again, and that brings up another levels palette. But you see here, we've got a mask. The white bit is the part we're going to change, that's our selected area, and the black bit is the part that we leave out. So that gets automatically generated when you make a selection and then choose an adjustment layer. So we can make our change just as we did before, move the black in a bit to make the background darker and move the midtones in a little bit. There we go. That gives us our darker background. And we've made all the same changes using adjustment layers that we made with our pixel layers when we copied the layers in the last stage. Okay, so now let's have another look at that status bar down here, and you'll see that we started with a 22.7 megabyte document, and we now have not 100 megabytes or 98 or whatever it was, we now have just 28.5 megabytes. So the first thing we discover is that we've only added a couple of meg by using all these adjustment layers. We can still switch them on and off just as we did before. There's our levels, there's our color balance, there's our background. But they're not taking up much space, so our computer doesn't have to work as hard processing these. Even better, you can actually switch them on or off independently. So we don't have levels and a levels plus color balance and then our top background layer. We can switch off just the levels or just the color balance or just the background. And if you save this image as a Photoshop document, a PSD document, all these adjustment layers are retained and you can jump back in and change any of them at any time you like. So if you think, well, our color balance isn't quite what we want or our first levels isn't quite what we want, we can adjust them whenever we feel like it. So I can click on my color balance adjustment just here and I can change it. I could go for a warmer highlights. I could make that really red and really hot. Or I could click on my levels adjustment and say, well, I don't want it to be quite so contrasty. I want to reduce the contrast just a little bit, just to ease it off a touch. Or we could even go to our background levels adjustment and change that and say, let's have it brighter like we did before. Let's have it quite bright like so. So with adjustment layers, you've got loads and loads of flexibility. It's efficient because it's not using up as much processing power. And you can change your mind by changing the settings, and you can easily see what each adjustment layer is doing by switching it on and off. So this is why adjustment layers are so brilliant and so smart as a method of working. They're actually one of the go-to commands in Photoshop. And for photographic enhancement, they're much more useful than pixel-based layers because they keep everything open and flexible. And because they're so important to image editing, I'm just going to run through it one more time just to make sure you really get what goes on. So I'll switch these off, I'll just group them together and then click the trash key to get rid of them all. There's our original image. Decide first of all what you want to do. So in this case, we want to improve the contrast and add some warmth and maybe darken the background. So let's sort out the contrast. We click on the adjustment layer icon and we go to levels. This brings up our histogram and we can improve contrast by taking out those gaps at either end of the histogram and giving us a full range of tones. The next one, we want to change the color balance to add more warmth to the image. So we click on the adjustment layer icon again and we choose color balance from the list. We want some more red and yellow in our highlights, so we select highlights, boost the reds and take the yellows up as well. We then do a little bit in the midtones, so a steeper diagonal through the three sliders in the midtones, and then shadows. Very often you want to add just a hint of blue. So that's our color balance adjustment made, and then the final thing was a tweak of the background. So for that we want a selection, because we want to separate the background from the subject, and we'll quickly do that. We'll just draw around the background and doing this very quickly and roughly. That's the sort of thing. That's that part of the background selected, and we got a little bit more down here, so we hold shift to add to the selection and we get this bit here, and then we need to soften the edge so we get a nice natural blend, and that was done through select and mask. And the only slider we need is the feather slider, so we take that up to around about 80. It will be more on a higher resolution image or less on a lower resolution image, but you can see the softness you're creating, so that's fine. We click OK to set down that change. And now we've made our selection, we make yet another adjustment, and this time we're going to use levels, and we move our sliders depending on what we want. So we make our background a little bit darker by moving the shadow slider there and the midtone slider. We can adjust them however we see fit, and that looks okay there. So that's how simple the adjustment layer process is, and you're separating your editing changes into all these different layers, which are all independent. So we switch them all off. There's the contrast change, there's the color balance change, and there's our background change. But we haven't actually edited any pixels at this point. There's the original still sitting underneath. All we've done is made data changes, and that's reflected in the lack of document size that we've created in doing this. We haven't added much in terms of the overall data, making it efficient to process, but we have maximized our flexibility because we can still change anything we like at any point in time. So I hope that all makes sense. That's the power of adjustment layers. They are incredibly useful, and it's worth just experimenting. Just open any image and experiment with making some simple changes like contrast or color balance, or selecting a little part of the image and making a change to that, just to get to grips with that adjustment layer concept. So get stuck into that. Enjoy using adjustment layers. They are absolutely brilliant. All right, see you next time.